Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this workshop on community and integration. Just as you come in the door, do grab the handout that's on the table at the back. You can also download that on your Reach Australia app and participate in the handout that way if you'd like to. My name is Tony Payne. I'm a member of the Reach Australia committee and very glad to welcome you to this workshop on community and integration, which really fits into the kind of ecosystem thinking that Ray and Andrew, especially Andrew, was presenting just before lunch. That a missional, evangelistically hearted community of faith is made up of multiple different pieces working together hopefully in harmony and effectively. And one of those pieces is how do we help someone who's a guest join and come and be part of our community of faith to learn and understand and imbibe who we are and to genuinely become a member of that community and for that community life to grow and be strong. And that's the topic we're going to address in this afternoon's workshop before afternoon tea, and then again it'll continue afterwards. And our two speakers are from Grace Community Church in Waterloo in Sydney. Tim Clemens is the lead pastor of Grace Community, and Amy Townsend is the director of membership, which is the sort of aspect of the ecosystem that's what they label this aspect, how to join the community and become part of it. She's the director of membership. She particularly oversees trying to see guests of the church becoming part of the church and joining the community. Grace City is having their 4th birthday, is that right, Tim? This Sunday, last Sunday. They currently have around 200 attending on average each Sunday. But interestingly, they have, Tim tells me, 245 unique visitors or guests come through their doors in the first quarter of this year, which is an extraordinary number. It's because of where the church is and of the kind of community it is, they get a lot of visitors. And so this is a key question for them. How can they get as many of those 245 as possible to become part of the church community, to come and hear the gospel, become Christians and join? The interesting thing, of course, is that for many of our churches, if we did track unique visitors, and I know many of you do, it's amazing how many there are. I was involved in that side of things in my own church a number of years ago, and I was astonished when you actually count them and try and keep track of people who visit, just how many turn up in any given year. And certainly in our case, what a poor job we were doing of connecting with those people and helping them to join the community. Tim and Amy are going to take us through some of the principles that they employ in this work and the journey that they try to take new people through. I've mentioned the outline, which is available in hard copy or soft copy if you've just come in. I think all that remains is for me to pray, and I'll hand over to Tim and Amy. Will you join me in prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for today, for this conference. We thank you for the privilege of having leadership roles in your people, among the community of faith in your church. We thank you for the challenge of welcoming in new people into our communities and helping them to integrate and become part of our communities. We thank you for the privilege of being able to help people do that and to keep growing into the life of the community. And Father, as we think about that subject, especially this afternoon, we ask you to be with us, that you be with Tim and Amy as they present, and all of us as we consider how we might do all of this more effectively. And we pray all this, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, in terms of Q&A and questions, it'll be much simpler and less technological than in the main auditorium. Tim and Amy will just pause and give you a chance to ask questions along the way. Simple as that. Over to you guys.
Well, good afternoon, and as Tony said, welcome to the workshop on community and integration. We've got lots of stuff that we've prepared and that we're excited to share with you. We've been praying and planning and really hoping that it will be a blessing to you and to the churches that you lead. And so there's lots of stuff that we're going to get stuck into over the course of our time together. But it is a workshop, and that means that we suspect there'll be lots of things that you might have tried in your own churches and so are learning from and would like to share with us. And we're excited about learning from that as well, both us, but also we think as a workshop together, there's lots of wisdom in the room that we'd love to hear from and learn from as we go through. Tony's just told you a little bit about who we are, so I'm going to skip over that a little bit, but why don't we, you know who we are, we're not yet sure who you are, and so I thought maybe it might just be worthwhile beginning by canvassing the room, who's in the room, and then also what are you keen to get out of our time this afternoon. So if it's okay, I might just ask you to raise a hand. Maybe just raise a hand if you're a senior minister, senior pastor, lead pastor, whatever title it is, just so we know who's in the room. Great, excellent. People who work in or oversee the, if you like, membership or integration or just the help people integrate into church life area. Okay, that's probably more of us. Team members, volunteers, staff, anyone else? Okay, excellent. All right, it's good to know we've got a variety of each of those. That's really helpful to know. Well, as I say, I'm keen to also know, we've got a bunch of stuff prepared, but it would also help us, I think, to know perhaps what to emphasise as we go through, what to maybe flesh out, just to know what you're hoping to get out of this afternoon's session. And so again, be brave, please. Throw a hand up. I'd love to just hear what are the things that you're hoping to get out of the session? What are the problems you're having in this area? What are the questions that you love answered before you leave at the end of 3 hours, which actually seems like quite a long time, but I think it'll fly by because there's lots to get through. So what are the things that you're hoping to get out of from today? Over here.
Learning how to build relationships and like trustful relationships between people who are non-Christians and yourself when you move into a new area.
Okay, all right. Hoping to learn how to build and connections with Christians, non-Christians when you move into a new area. Thanks very much. Others? Up the back.
How you go about welcoming people who are in different stages of life,
Mm.
with uni students or single professionals.
Sure.
Families,
Okay.
as well.
Yeah, excellent. So how do you integrate and welcome people from various different stages of life, those with kids, those without, uni students, etc., up the back?
How to build a sense of responsibility for all those things into the hearts of the existing believers.
Yeah, okay. How do you, so as church staff teams, we're often really conscious of these things, but how do you mobilise and build a sense of responsibility into the whole church and your congregation? Great. Others? Up the back here. Tim?
Moving from like a small church, which is quite interconnected community,
Yep.
being a medium-sized church, being a bit disconnected, and then how to build community in that medium-sized church.
Okay, so moving from a small to a medium, perhaps even larger church, and what are the different steps you might take to, because it's going to look different in different church sizes. Cool? Others? Over here.
Integration of multicultural groups coming into the church and
Yep.
actually blending them completely so they
Yep.
can stay as unique people.
Yeah. So integrating multicultural groups. Awesome. Others? Over. Kim?
The back door and how much time resources you put into people who do not connect.
Yeah. So the back door, how much resource do you put towards helping people who aren't connecting? Come on, guys, step into church life. It's good. Over here.
I was just saying the timing and the priorities for implementation. So
Yeah.
if there's a lot of great ideas that are shared today,
Yeah.
is there suggestions in what you do first?
Yeah, it's good. So prioritization. You can't do everything. You might be doing lots already, but if you're not doing, there's lots of things. Which ones do I start with? Great.
Balance between a hospitality, relational-based welcoming, and then course-based kind of information dump welcoming.
It's good. So balance. By the way, I'm repeating this for the recording. I know many of you can hear it, but the balance between hospitality versus course, that sort of stuff. That's great. Let's go 3 more, if that's okay. Over here, Mikey.
How would I say it? The triaging and discerning
Yep.
of newcomers. Maybe an example of church hoppers.
Mm.
Some issues around that.
Yep.
Concern.
Yeah. Okay. So triaging various different people. You're going to get lots of people visiting your church. Some of whom are church shoppers. How do you deal with all of those things? Great. Yeah. Up the back.
Thinking of the possibility of growth groups and their role in community integration.
Yeah, excellent. So role of growth groups, community groups, small groups, whatever you call them, in the role of community integration. Good. Yes, thank you. And yeah, we'll go with the last one.
Integrating people that have been scarred by the church in the past.
Okay. Yeah, lots of people who are coming to our churches, it's not their first time at church. They've been scarred by a different church. How do we love and care for them and integrate them into what we hope will be really transformative experiences in our churches? So loving and caring for them. Well, that's really helpful to just get a sense of the stuff that you're thinking through and would love resolved. Honestly, we've got a bunch of stuff. As you were sharing, I'm like, oh, we've got something that addresses that. Oh, we don't have anything that addresses that. So we might not cover everything, but again, as I say, there will be opportunity to share ideas or ask questions as we go through. So perhaps during that time, we can each sort of share some of the things that perhaps we haven't covered explicitly. So one, I might just invite you to open up your booklets to this graphic, because this graphic will just give you a sense of where we're going. We always like pictures, and so I think this picture will really just try to flesh out the structure of where we're going over the following 3 hours. Pay attention to the numbers. So the first number you'll see is in the heart, and there's a handful of other numbers throughout. But just working through each of those, today we're gonna do 6 things. We're gonna begin with some foundational convictions about why biblical community is so important and some of the necessary ingredients to build it. Second of all, we're going to talk about integration pathways and why we think they're so helpful. Third, we'll talk about the 8 things that we think you need to pay attention to in order to make sure you're being welcoming and hospitable. Andrew used the phrase oozing hospitality. We'll use that phrase as well. How can we be churches that ooze hospitality? Fourth, we'll talk about the member joining process. Probably this will take place after the break, so probably the first 3 things in the first half, second 3 in the second half. We'll talk about the member joining process and the 5 mental steps someone's likely to go through in joining into your church. We'll talk about number 5, the membership course or interview or whatever you want to call it, and why this gives you the opportunity to define for people coming into your church what membership in your church actually involves and looks like from a biblical perspective. And then 6, we'll talk about how we can help people to keep growing once they've joined our churches, because membership really is just the beginning of the growth journey. So that's where we're going, but I might jump in and start with some biblical convictions to help us begin. The danger of a seminar like this one is that we spend all our time focusing on the practical tips and tricks that we can use to build and then integrate people into our communities. And we sort of just assume that we're all on the same page about what biblical communities are and why they're so important. Another danger is actually that some of the systems and structures that we're going to give you or share with you today could just as easily be used to build a big crowd rather than a biblical church. And so with that in mind, we wanted to actually just make sure we lay some key foundations. First, about why it's so important that the churches we're building or communities are biblical churches, not big crowds. And then second of all, some of the necessary ingredients for them. So we'll jump in and talk about the importance of building biblical churches rather than big crowds. And I'll give you 3 reasons I think this is so important. The first is that church communities are important because they glorify God. And so you might be familiar, we're not going to read it now, but in Ephesians 2 and 3, Paul talks about the difference between Jews and Gentiles before Christ and their standing before God, and Jews and Gentiles after Christ's death and resurrection, and how that changes our standing before God. And so we won't read it, but you're probably familiar with the passage. As you can see on the left, before Christ, there was this massive dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, and the Jews had Christ, citizenship in Israel, the covenants, they had hope, they had God. What did the Gentiles have? Nothing. And yet, through his death, Christ breaks down that dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, creating one new humanity in Christ. And so that's what the gospel has created. So that's what Jesus has done. But the question I want to focus on now is why? I'm going to keep that back. Why has God done this? Well, we get the answer to that in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10 and 12. It should be on your outlines. But it says his intent, that is God's intent, was that now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. In other words, why did God create this one new humanity out of the two? It's so that when anyone looked at it, whether in heaven or on earth, they would see just how glorious, just how magnificent, and just how wise God really is. And so I want you just to imagine for a moment the conversation between the angels in heaven that started taking place when Jews and Gentiles started getting together in local churches. Right? The only thing that they had in common was centuries of hatred and resentment. And then all of a sudden, these two completely different groups of people start getting together in local churches and loving each other like family. That would have given heaven something to talk about. Now, most of our churches, I suspect, don't have this modern day equivalent of the hostility between Jews and Gentiles. But I don't think that means we can't still give heaven something to talk about. And so take a look at what Jamie Dunlop writes in his book, The Compelling Community. He writes, as people with little in common in the world's eyes love each other as if they're closer than family, all heaven looks on with wonder at what the gospel has created. And so the first reason it's so important for us to build biblical communities at church is that these are the things that are going to glorify God. Right? You can build a big crowd around all sorts of common things, common demographic, common life stages, common ages. But when our communities are made up with people with little in common but Jesus Christ, that's when God's wisdom is going to be most clearly manifest to the world. So there's the first reason. Second reason is that church communities enable Christians to one another. And so you might be aware of this or not, I'm not sure, but there are 59 one another commands in the Bible. It's just this Greek word aleilon, we translate it, one another. 15 of them are explicit commands to love. Love as Jesus has loved us, that kind of stuff. But that leaves still quite a lot. I think the others are really helpful for putting flesh on the bones of what does it actually mean for us to obey these commands, to love one another. And I think just as importantly, it's worth knowing that all but 2 of those commands come in the context of the epistles to specific local churches. And so our local churches are supposed to be the place in which we one another. Now, if you ever want to go and do the research, feel free to just Google this or use your Bible software to look up all the different places. But as I was preparing, I reckon each of the one another commands kind of helpfully summarized under, if you like, loving attitudes, loving actions. And so under loving actions, we're told to carry one another's burdens, serve one another, submit to one another, teach one another, encourage one another, build up one another, spur on one another, pray for one another, be hospitable to one another. Under loving attitudes, we're told to be devoted to one another, honor one another, accept one another, have equal concern for one another, be kind and compassionate to one another, and in humility to value others more highly than ourselves. Now, finally, it's worth paying attention to the fact that we're called to do this in the context of communities that are full of other sinful people. All right, that's what the church is. We're saved sinners. And so that's also why there's a bunch of other commands about confess your sins to one another, bear with one another. Right? There are people in the church you can bear with in love because they're sinful like you. And likewise, we're called to forgive one another. And so at the end of the day, these are the kinds of church communities that we're seeking to build under God and integrate people into. Right? We want communities to be Christ-like and servant-hearted, not just made up of people who want to get their religious goods and services from your church. Because that's a big crowd, not a biblical church. And so the second reason church communities are so important is that they provide the context in which we can one another. The third, though, is that church communities are the final apologetic to the world. And so in John 17, you might be familiar with this. John 17, Jesus prays his kind of famous high priestly prayer. Towards the end, he says these words. He said, my prayer is not for them alone, right? So not for just the apostles, the disciples. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. And so Jesus is praying here that the Christians would demonstrate the kind of unity between themselves that he and the Father have, and that we've already seen from Ephesians 2 and 3 that we now have in light of what Christ has done for us at the cross. But I want you to notice why. Why does he pray this? Well, he says at the end, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Francis Schaeffer, in his book, The Mark of a Christian, calls this the final apologetic of the gospel. So he writes, yet without true Christians loving one another, Christ says the world cannot be expected to listen, even when we give proper answers. Let us be careful indeed to spend a lifetime studying to give honest answers, but after we have done our best to communicate to a lost world, still, we must never forget that the final apologetic which Jesus gives is the observable love of true Christians for true Christians. And so therefore the third and final, if you like, reason it's so important for us to build and integrate people into biblical church communities is that our church communities are the final apologetic to the gospel. This is a conference about reaching Australia. Gathering a big crowd won't help us to reach Australia. Because unless we are actually building biblical church communities, our church practice may well undermine the very gospel that we preach. So that's why biblical church communities, I want to suggest, are so important. They glorify God. They give us Christians a context to actually one another, and they are also a final apologetic to the world. But how do we build them? Well, this is going to lead into the second set of convictions. I'll give you 3 more, and then we'll get into some of the practical stuff, which we're going to spend the rest of our 3 hours on together. So the second thing is the key ingredients for building biblical church communities. Let me just read Acts 6, because I'm going to get them out of this. It says, in those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and they said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. This proposal pleased the whole group. And so they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. Also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, a convert of Judaism. They presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. And so the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. So according to this passage, what might be some of the 3 ingredients, if you like, to help us build biblical church communities? Well, number 1 is the word and prayer. The foundational thing to notice is the priority of the word and prayer. So in verse 2, the apostles let everyone know it's not right for us to neglect the ministry of the word to wait on tables. And likewise in verse 4, they say, we will give our attention to the ministry of the word and prayer. And so the apostles knew what their job was, and they knew what their job wasn't. The apostles were the preachers and prayers, not the table waiters. And furthermore, according to verse 7, it was precisely because they refused to give in to the temptation to get sucked into waiting on tables that the word of God goes forth, and therefore the number of believers in Jerusalem increased. And so this goes back to my point earlier. If you implement all the tips and tricks we're going to give you today, but neglect the ministry of the word and prayer, you are probably going to build a big crowd, not a biblical church. And so therefore, senior ministers or senior pastors or lead pastors or whatever you want to call yourself, I know you know this, but just remember, the most important thing you can do to grow a biblical church is to give yourself wholeheartedly to the word of God and prayer. However, it's not necessarily all you should do, and it's certainly not necessarily what everybody in your church ought to be doing. Because that leads us onto the second key ingredient, which is that you need a team of helpers. Right, and so just because the apostles didn't think that they should wait on tables, didn't mean that they thought no one should wait on tables. Actually, it's quite the opposite. The role of making sure that no one was overlooked in the daily distribution of food was so important that they actually, in verse 3, says they found 7 godly men for the task and handed the responsibility over to them. Now, some people will see this as the installation of the diaconate. That's fine. You could also maybe just see it as the beginning of the first lay ministry team. Right? The apostles recognised as an important job to do. They couldn't do it themselves, and they say they found a group of others to help them in the task of caring for the people. And so again, I want to say, senior pastors, lead ministers, whatever you are, you can and you should model a lifestyle of welcoming and hospitality and all those things. But you can't make sure that everyone in your church is feeling connected and isn't overlooked. But that's okay, because that is neither biblical nor realistic, but others can. Others can help you in that work. And so find a team of others and hand some of the things we're going to be talking about today over to them to help you in the task. I reckon I cannot emphasize this one highly enough. We're going to give you a lot of stuff to think about implementing in your church. You cannot do it all, so you need a team of helpers to help you in the task. By the way, you also don't need a staff team to be doing this. You might be here as a single staff church. You don't need a staff team to do this. Maybe this seminar will be recorded. Give this recording to a high-capacity volunteer in your church. Say, hey, would you be willing to help us as a church implement some of these things, take responsibility? You need a team of helpers if these things are going to take place. And so third and final ingredient you need are some organisational systems and structures. It seems to me that some Christians will have a relatively naive, maybe well-intentioned, but naive allergy to organisational structures. I don't really get it personally, but there does seem to be an assumption that structures make things less organic, less personal, less loving. Now that may work in a church of 10, but even then you're probably going to have some structures. But as soon as your church really gets to over 20, you're going to have some structures to make sure that no one gets overlooked. And I think we do see this with the apostles. Now, the whole purpose of Acts 6 is not to teach us about ministry structures, but you see some of these things reflected in the way that they behaved. Because the Jerusalem church had reached a size where people were slipping through the cracks, they're being overlooked. And so in order to address, if you like, an organic problem within their community, the apostles create a layer, if you like, of organisational structure. In other words, their structures enabled them to care for and be more personal and loving with the various people in their church. I think that ought to be the primary goal of the structures that we build into our churches. And so if our current structures, or maybe lack of structures, are inhibiting community, or we can build new structures to help facilitate biblical community, then I think we ought to be doing so. Systems and structures aren't inherently right or wrong. There's just practical ways of helping us to love and care for large numbers of people. And so therefore, I think a key part of building and integrating people into our communities will be developing and maintaining the right kinds of systems and structures to help us as churches and leadership teams to love and care for the people that God is bringing to our churches. So there you go. I just want to start with some key kind of foundations so that we're on the same page about some of these things. What are the key ingredients for building church communities? The Word of God and prayer, that's foundational. You also need a team of helpers to actually help you out. And then I do believe you need some organisational systems and structures. That's what we're going to spend most of the rest of our time thinking about together. But before we do that, quick mental break. Why don't you, maybe with one or two around you, if you're in your team, if it's just you, that's fine. Maybe just with one or two around you, identify your key helpers, if you've got any at your church, or maybe if you don't, maybe write down one or two names of the people that you might like to ask to be helpers in this area. And then also maybe write down some of your key structures for community and integration. Spend a bit of time doing that, because that'll be helpful, I think, as we work through the rest of our time together. I'll call you back in a minute or two. Might call you back if I may. So we've just been thinking about biblical convictions. That's kind of our first big thing that we want to do. The second thing we want to focus on is integration pathways. And as we jump in, I would suggest that the most foundational structure your church needs is some kind of discipleship pathway. That is, you need some way of moving people from non-Christian through to mature disciple or disciple-making disciple, or whatever you want to call the end goal of the Christian life this side of heaven. Now, there are plenty of them out there, lots of different models out there. At least 3 that I'm aware of would be the Connect, Grow, Serve model. Sometimes you add go into the end. I think that is a modification of something from Simple Church. Another model out there would be the Engage, Evangelize, Establish, Equip model, at least from what I could read on a briefing article. An old one, comes from Dave Mansfield. A third option would be the Community, Crowd, Congregation, Committed, Core model, which you can see there. Now, this seminar is called Community and Integration. In each of the examples above, integration, right, that word, strictly refers to moving people through the full length of that discipleship pathway, right? Not simply getting them into the first one, into the pathway to begin with. And so in the first one, it's about moving people from connect to grow, to serve, to go. In the second, it's about moving people from being engaged through to evangelize, through to being established, through to being equipped. And with the third, obviously, it's about moving people from the community, that outer circle, through the various stages until they're inside in the core. In other words, the integration journey doesn't technically finish until someone has finished your pathway. Now, which pathway you choose is probably less important than the fact that you actually have one. Because the power of the pathway is that it helps you break down where the people are at in your church on their discipleship journey, and it helps you to reflect on what can I do to help these people take their next step in the life of our church and in their discipleship journey. Furthermore, I think having a pathway also helps you to reflect on the purpose behind your existing programs and whether you need to improve them, shut them down, or just start new ones. So maybe just a quick poll. You might be here and maybe you've got no systems, but we might also have people in the room using one of these three that I've just outlined. Be curious to know, can I get a show of hands? Anyone who uses Connect, Grow, Serve, Go, or some variation of that? A handful? Okay, great, cool. Anyone using the Engage, Evangelize, Establish, Equip framework? Excellent, cool, that's great. Anyone using the 5 C's, the kind of purpose-driven church thing? Okay. That's really helpful to know we've got a bunch of different people using different approaches. Amy?
Thanks, Tim. As Tony mentioned, my role at Grace City is to look after a lot of this stuff and making sure that we are really intentionally connecting people into the life of church. So what I'm going to do now is just give a little demonstration of the integration pathway that we use at Grace City. So of those 3 examples Tim mentioned, we do use that third one, the 5 C's. And so what I want us to do is break this down so we can think about how we intentionally meet the needs of different people at various stages in their journey into the life of your church, our church, a church. So there is a graphic in your handout which will probably be helpful to look at as we talk through this. It's got shades of blue, and we're going to dig into each of those 5 layers, each of those 5 C's just briefly. And so the first one on the outside is community. Now at Grace City we define the community as being made up of anyone who lives within 25 minutes drive of our local based church. And so we actually task our communications teams and our mission teams with the responsibility of trying to get people from our community into our crowd, which is that next layer on this particular pathway. So between our comms teams and our mission teams, it might be through marketing, it might be through personal evangelism, it might be through community events. Those types of things is that first layer on a person's journey into the life of our church. And so the next layer is crowd. Now we define the crowd as being made up of first-time guests through to regular attenders. So at our church, in our context, we define a regular attender as anyone who has visited 3 or more times in a 3-month period. So that's what we define as a regular attender. Now those people might be Christians, they might be non-Christians, but we actually task our membership teams and our mission teams with getting these people ready or actually moving them into the congregation, because they could be anyone. And so, for example, our mission team would have a specific focus on converting the non-Christian, or even reconditioning and refocusing someone who might call themselves a Christian but has been out of church for a long time. We have courses like Explore Group that are purposed towards that. Whereas our membership team would have a really strong focus on trying to get Christians to become members by doing our membership course, which is called On Board. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in our session. So that's the first 2 layers, community and crowd. And now we move to congregation. So once someone completes our On Board, our membership course, they become a formal member, what we call a formal member. And that's how they join our congregation. So at this point, our maturity team is going to jump in. And our maturity team will contact this new member, and their main first focus is to get this person connected into a community group or Bible study growth group. You might have a different name for it. Now, we do have some members in our church who haven't quite yet got plugged into a community group, whether they're new or maybe they've been around for a while, but that is quite rare in the life of our church. I think our most recent statistic would say about 91% of our formal members are in a community group, which is something we really are excited about and we do strive towards very intentionally. So from congregation, we move to that banner committed. So that's when we have the ministry team jump in. And the responsibility of the ministry team is to move members, usually about a month to 6 weeks after they've landed in a community group. We do want to give new members time to settle. They'll be approached by the ministry team. And the real purpose there is to have a good sit down, a good chat. We would call it a ministry interview, and help that new person think about how they can connect more into the life of church by serving, by using their gifts, by continuing to meet people and contribute through being on a ministry team. The ministry interview, that's just pretty much a 30-minute sit down with one of our ministry reps where they'd be revisioned of what we're trying to do at Grace City Church, encouraged towards what the Bible has to say about ministry, and then really practically just think about how they can use their gifts in the life of church. And then finally, we've got that layer of the core. Now, at present, we don't really have any official teams responsible for moving people from committed and to the core, but we would define this group as those people in the life of church who are sacrificing the 3 T's, who are sacrificing time, talent, and treasure for the mission of Grace City and the mission of the kingdom. And so it's a bit of a loosely defined group, but it's our way of reminding ourselves that the integration journey, what we're talking about over this 3-hour session, it doesn't just end when someone does on board or when someone lands in a community group or when someone joins a ministry team. It's actually an ongoing journey where we long to see people continuously and increasingly captured and having hearts that are captivated for God and his purpose and his glory in this world. And I just want to say as well that I didn't start at Grace City as a staff member. When I started at Grace City, I was just a regular church goer, and then I was envisioned through this pathway. Actually, I'd never considered doing ministry before. Before I knew it, I was doing MTS, and after that 2-year journey, I actually formally joined the staff team. So you really never know who God's brought along to your church and what that pathway is going to do for envisioning someone for a life of gospel ministry. So that's just a little bit of encouragement from my story, but I'll invite Tim back up.
Thanks, Amy. So I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about what's today's focus going to be on. Using the language of the M's, we won't actually do this a whole lot in this seminar, but using the language of the M's, strictly speaking, this would be a membership seminar. That might not mean anything to you, that's okay. But it therefore basically means that even though we will touch on some of the community groups or growth group stuff or ministry teams, serving teams, those kinds of things, the primary focus on today's workshop is really on how to move people from the crowd, how to move people from the crowd into the congregation. And furthermore, given just, I think, in that room next door, there's a workshop, a Mission Pathways workshop focused on how to engage and then evangelize the non-Christian in particular. We are going to focus also on the Christians. And so so getting Christians from the crowd into the congregation. So if converting, discipling, working with non-Christians and helping them make next steps is something you want to discuss, then by all means feel free to ask questions at any point. Though given that there is another seminar on these sorts of things, we probably won't be able to address all of those questions to the degree that you might be interested. So you'll see this kind of picture in your outlines. So how do you move someone from the crowd into your congregation? Well, the first thing to recognise is that there are typically 3 mini bridges that someone will need to cross in order to join your church. Right? Even if you don't have an official membership course or anything like that, these will still be true at your church. Just how you define what a member is might be slightly less, clear. And so as you can see, someone crosses bridge 1 when they come back to your church for a second time. They cross bridge 2 when they come back to your church for a third or more time. And they cross bridge 3 when they go from being a regular attender to a member at your church. Now, if you're wondering, okay, well, that's maybe helpful. What are some of the practical benefits of this? The first thing I would say is that just appreciate the power of simply recognising the fact that these 3 bridges exist. Knowledge is power. And so once you know that these 3 steps exist, you can start to think about practical ways in which you can help the people who are making this journey to cross each of those bridges at their various point in that journey. And so, for example, you can start asking things like, is there anything we can do to help the first-time guest more like to make a second-time visit? How can we help serve their particular needs? What do they need to know about in order to feel comfortable to come back a second time? Or you can start asking questions like, well, what about our second-time guests, right? Presumably they've come back for a reason. And so how are their needs different from a first-time guest and also different from a regular attender? You know, someone who's not a member yet, but they've been around for a while. What do they need to come back for a third and a fourth time? And how's that different to some of the others? And then what about those who come regularly but aren't in membership with us, right? You can start asking questions like, what is stopping them from taking that next step into church life? And what do they need before they're willing to call this church home, and how can we help them in that journey? Simply recognising the reality of the steps, I would suggest, will help you to love and care for each of the people that are coming to your church according to their particular needs, rather than just having a blanket way of treating everyone the same, no matter where they are on the journey. The second major benefit of these steps comes when you're able to record how many people you have at each of these steps. And so, for example, we keep track of this data at Grace City. I think this will be in your handouts as well. Now, to the degree that we can. It's not perfect because we often miss people. But the graph on the left tells you the raw numbers for quarter 1, so term 1, if you like, 3 years in a row, while the graph on the right breaks each year down into percentages of how that all correlates and works together. And so I want to invite you, maybe just take a moment, do the case study in your booklets. The question to ask is, imagine this data represented your church. How might you use it to help you improve the effectiveness of your pathways and more lovingly integrate people into church life? Spend a bit of time chatting with the people around you. Have a go at that, and I'd love to hear some responses. Right, I'll pull you back if I may. So, I don't know if I made it explicit or not. This represents our church, so help us out. If this was your church, what should we do? How can we more effectively help people integrate into church life in our context? What would you do? Hand up.
Can I just ask a
Of course you can.
how do you define church life, integrating it into church life?
Great question. In some ways, integrated into church life is summarised by that previous, this one. So someone who's making their way through various different steps into the life of our church. So someone who, they've not only come, they've kind of we'll get into some of these things later, they said, this is my church, I'd love to serve and minister among the people here. They're in a community group as well, which is another context in which we can grow and mature in the ministry of the word and prayer. And then they're also not only serving in informal ways, but they're also serving in slightly more formal capacities at church. So that's what I'm referring to by integrated into church life. What are some tips? Help me out. Yeah.
Just a big chunk of people that come once.
Yeah.
You just notice that.
Big time. You got any tips for me? Yeah. Okay, you definitely noticed that. What next?
I think one tip is to find out are they just visiting because they're flying through Sydney,
Yeah.
or whether they actually live
Yeah.
around and
Yeah.
moved or whatever.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't worry too much about people just visiting their grandchildren.
Yeah. It's good. So we live about 5 kilometres south of the CBD, but 5 kilometres north of the Sydney airport. And so we get a lot of people just flying through over here.
Humility. The regular tender, so you're getting more people coming 3 times than you are twice. So it would be interesting to see what's happening to that 3rd and 4th visit.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Why some people are moving into membership and then some
And others aren't. They just keep sitting there. What are they doing? I know.
So are those people just staying regular? Are they attending?
Yeah, so what it does is this will just summarise 1 quarter. But it tells you that in the last 3 months, we've had that many people come at least 3 times. A number of them will continue to keep coming over several quarters in a row and not join us in membership, but this is a snapshot of 1 quarter. Yeah, at the back.
We've had a similar situation in previous churches that I was part of, and we had a lot of pushback at the green to the yellow in church and
Yeah.
having to do a course, having to
Yeah.
because from the context that I work with,
Mm.
it's like, well, we've always been part of this denomination. Why do we have to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. And we will think about some of the pros and cons of members doing an official course or something like that a little later. That's good. That'll come in the second session. Maybe one more. Yeah.
Also got to think about whether it's if you've got a welcoming team doing a great job, are
Mm.
there other things?
Yeah.
There's something in service
Mm.
that you need to think of, so not just your sort of connecting team, thinking about the whole church start thinking about the help.
Yeah, so that's a real systems approach. It's stepping back and thinking about the ecosystem. It may not simply be that our welcoming teams aren't doing a good job. Maybe it's something in the service. And so, yeah, that really plays into the connectedness of all of church life. All right, well, thanks for that. I think in the little summary thing, it tells you 4 benefits. I reckon there's at least 4 benefits in recording and then reviewing data like this. So for example, I think the first would be it enables you to identify blockages. And so we might look at this data and think, wow, there's lots of people that visit our church once. Who said that? Yeah, that's precisely what I notice as I look at this and get depressed about. And so it looks like a massive blockage for us, and it may well be. And so we go, all right, well, how could we help more people to integrate into church? Well, we need to help them cross over that first bridge. And so, we could try and come up with some new initiatives and try and implement those and see if it helps people come back. Now, if we continue recording the data, that'll lead on to the second benefit, which is that it'll enable us to assess the effectiveness of our new initiatives that we're trialling. And so by comparing this year's results with last year's, we can see whether the initiatives we've implemented were actually effective. This is where I think it's helpful to pay attention to the percentages, because in our context, we've been trying to address this issue of getting our first-time visitors to come back for a second time for years, and you'll notice that we really haven't made much of a tangible difference. Which I think leads on to the third benefit, and that is that you can start to identify trends, which I think this picks up on something that Kim down the front was suggesting. Because over the last 3 years, the number of first-time guests who never come back has pretty much been consistent within a few percentage points. Now, it could be that we just haven't got it right yet. And so we haven't given up on trying to help these people take their second step. Then again, the more that we've sort of chatted to various people, and it's somewhat anecdotal, I asked someone to, figure out all of who they were and ask why they didn't come back. But we've kind of increasingly discovered that actually a lot of these people are overseas visitors. They're family and friends or Christians who've heard about us, want to check out that newish sort of church plant. They've got no intention of ever joining us, and that's fine. But I think being aware of some of those trends leads on to the fourth benefit, which is it enables us to identify the most strategic use of our actually pretty limited resources. And so if roughly 50% of the people who visit our church have no intention of ever coming back, we've learned that the best use of our limited resources is going to be to focus on those who've sort of already made that first bridge. And so in other words, we'll do what we can in a general way to help people cross the first bridge, but we don't have the resources to go out and hold everyone's hand while they do it. And if we did anyway, probably 50% of those would have no intention of coming back, at which point it's probably not the wisest use of our actually limited resources. And so in our context, that's just some of the ways that recording and then reviewing the data, we do this on a quarterly basis. Amy is going to help us think through just practically how would you do this now.
You might look at those charts and think, how on earth do they get that? That's impossible for me in my context. But bear with me, I'm going to give you some hints and explain how we actually gather up this data. So there are 2 ways that we gather this data at Grace City. We're going to dig into both of these methods in the next section, but I'll just touch on them briefly. So the first way is through the welcome card, and the second way is through conversations. So our welcome cards, we gather data. We'll talk more, again, as I just said, about what the welcome card looks like and how it's shaped in the life of our Sunday. But the welcome card is the first thing, and we actually encourage all of our guests to complete a welcome card, and we also make that really easy for them. To be explained later. The second way is through conversations, specifically through conversations with our hosting teams. Again, we'll talk about hosting teams later. Your church might call them welcomers or ushers, something else. For us, we call them hosts. And so through our welcome cards and through our conversations that our hosts have, that is where we pull together lots of data. Now, at this stage, we have one amazing volunteer on our membership team who collates this. So on a Sunday, our hosts will collect all of our welcome cards, and then our hosts will write a report about everyone that they spoke to. That might be lots of information, that might be a little bit of information, and then they'll pass all of that, welcome cards and the report, to this fantastic volunteer who's very gracious with her time. Now, she gathers all of this information together and she inputs that into our church management system. So we use a system called Alvanto. There's lots of, as Tim said earlier at the start of the session, you don't have to consider what we do specifically, but having a church management system is a great thing to do, and there's lots of great ones out there. We use Alvanto. Now, at this stage in the process of gathering the welcome cards, gathering the hosting report, there's quite a strong focus on the first timer, because first timers are usually the people who will definitely fill out a welcome card, and our hosts particularly target our first timers. So what do we do with that? We actually want to use that information in our church database in Alvanto to create a profile for that person. Once you have a profile for a person, there are so many things you can do. And I just want to acknowledge as well, a profile does not have to be first name, last name, birth date, phone, email. It can literally be, I met John, he moved to the area, I have no more information about him. So don't be overwhelmed by the concept of a profile. But once you have a profile for someone, that's when you can really start going, oh, that's John. We don't know his last name yet. And you can start, and your hosting teams can start identifying with that person. And so from that stage, what we do is we mark a role every Sunday. Every Sunday, we mark a role of both of our members, but also of our Johns who we don't know his last name, and our second timers, and our third timers, etc., etc. Now, from the welcome card with the hosting report, they're input into Alvanto with a profile, and then every week we mark the role. And that's how we start to recognise that person's a first timer, that person's a second timer, that person's come 3+ times. Oh, that person's done on board now. They're classified as a member. They've made a little shift in our Alvanto system. Now, Tim mentioned earlier that this data is not flawless. There's people we miss. There's always people in the life of church who come in late, sneak out early. They literally have written on their head, please don't talk to me. That's okay. God is good, and under him and being a prayerful team, you have the opportunity to just do the best and trust, maybe that person will come back. We'll do the best that we have with the information that we have, and I can't recommend that profile aspect enough. Now, you might still be feeling a bit overwhelmed by this chart and Alvanto and hosting teams and welcome cards and great volunteers who you don't have. Let me make a few qualifications to just make that a little bit simpler if that seems overwhelming. So Tim mentioned right at the beginning, one of the key ingredients to a biblical community is a team of helpers. I can't reiterate that enough. A team of helpers is essential. It's worth saying we don't have any formally paid staff members involved in this process anymore. So our welcome cards, our hosting, people who process that data, they are all helpers who are volunteering their time, which is very, very exciting. The second thing, so a team of helpers matters. The second thing is we didn't always use Alvanto. There was a stage where we used Google Sheets. So if paying for a church management system is really difficult for in the life of your church at the moment, that's okay. Or even if you only need a church management system for this one thing and it's not worth it, that's okay. We used Google Sheets for a long time. It required a little bit more work, a few more intelligent brains than mine when it comes to technical things, but we made that work. One reason we particularly transitioned to Alvanto was with the size of the volume of visitors we started getting, but also with privacy issues. We just started really feeling that we weren't honouring our guests and the privacy of their information as well as we could have. So that's when we transitioned. And the third thing worth saying is you might actually already have a bunch of this data without even realising it. If you have any form of welcome card or ability for someone to sign up for something, you're gathering data. And so the really important thing is just to know what to do with it. If your members of your church are talking to guests, you are gathering data. And so how can you try to get that information and use it to encourage people to keep connecting into the life of your church? So 3 little qualifications. The team of helpers matters. We didn't always use Elvanto. There's lots of other options out there, free options in particular, and try to pinpoint where you might actually already be collecting data. And Tim already mentioned that this type of graph as well, we only look at once a quarter. So we kind of let this data come in on a week-to-week basis. It just simmers away. And then at the end of each quarter, we gather that all together, make it look a little bit more pretty. And then as a team, we look at it, which comes back to that other question before of, hey, the membership team or the integration pathway, we're doing a great job. So what's happening in the other areas of church that's causing that big drop off or something like that? So we look at it from a team environment. So that brings us to the end of this second part in our journey this afternoon. Does anyone have any questions at this stage before we jump into part 3, which is the oozing hospitality? Hello. Okay, so the question is, you use Elvanto, doesn't having so many first-time visitors fill up your Elvanto quota? Secret tip, Elvanto has this function called contact, which if you mark someone as a contact, you don't pay for them on there. It limits how much you can do with that contact on Elvanto, but yeah. Hello.
Just interested how you get your welcome team first and foremost, and then your people second to fill out the card. The biggest challenge with that is actually getting the data.
Getting the data.
Feel really awkward about asking.
Yeah, great question. We will be digging into that a little bit more in our second section as we think specifically about the welcome card and specifically about the hosts. So if I haven't answered it in this next section, come back to us about how to get that data. Yes, hello.
Ray, for me, how big is your welcome team? And what's your average weekly attendance?
Great. We strive to have 5 hosts on a Sunday. That varies. On an average Sunday, we have 2 services, a 9 and 11 a.m. We have approximately 100 people per service. That gives or takes each week. In terms of newcomers, oh, the data's gone. That's what we're looking at. And so some week. It's worth saying as well, our 11 a.m. service gets a lot more newcomers than our 9 a.m. So we've actually had to adjust our hosting teams as well to fatten them up a little bit at the 11 a.m. to cope with the incoming people. One more. Who marks our role? Great question. That is our hosting teams. Also, I do it sneakily because I think it's really fun, personally. But I've been away the last couple of weeks. It's our hosting teams who do it. And then our staff team actually take a moment in our staff meeting on a Monday to check it and then also take that opportunity to go, blah, blah has been away for a while. How are they going? Or, we use it as an additional thing for care. That's specifically with members. Yeah, our hosting teams all have an additional access on Elvanto and they use their phones. There's an iPad available, but they use their phones. One more.
Can you say what's the approximate ratio of people who fill in a card to those who simply have their information comes in by conversation?
We do have a ratio. Most people fill in cards. The conversations we have are usually in addition to what has happened on the card. And then usually if someone hasn't filled in a card, they've definitely been pinpointed as a conversation because our hosts, they're pretty sneaky. They keep an eye out when the cards are being done and they go, so-and-so over there hasn't filled in a card, jump on them. So yeah, we do try hard. But there are always people who slip through the cracks, yeah. We will jump into section 3, which is oozing hospitality. So follow along on the handout there. So we've talked about the bridges. We've identified that they begin with the first timer needs to come across. So we want to ask, how can we help them begin that journey? And in that, now we want to suggest that the most critical thing your church can do to get someone over this second bridge is what we call oozing hospitality. What can our church do? Actually, Andrew Hurd used that in the previous session. He stole it from us. Oozing hospitality. And this is just an outworking of the mindset that we are encouraged to have in Romans 15:7. So Romans 15:7 says, accept one another then, just as Christ has accepted you in order to bring praise to God. So in this verse, we see that everything we're trying to achieve through community and integration actually starts with the fact that Christ has accepted us first. And so I want us to play a little game for a second. I want us to imagine that we are hosting a brunch, maybe a lunch, maybe a dinner party. You can choose your own adventure. You're having people over, and I want you to just take a moment to think about how you prepare when you have people over. So it would vary depending on who you are, depending on your context, your family, your living situation. But I'm hoping things are coming to mind like cleaning the bathroom, tidying the house, putting the kids' toys away, preparing food, maybe lighting a scented candle, maybe a bit of ambient music in the background. So all of these things that we think to do when we're hosting people, when we're hoping to ooze hospitality. Because we go to this trouble because we want our guests to feel welcomed, and hopefully even one step further, we want them to come back again. So if that's how we act when we're expecting guests in our own home, surely we should act that way when we are expecting guests at our church. Now, of course, you do have to contextualise this because, for example, lighting a candle at home can mean something very different to lighting a candle at church. And so you need to think a little bit broader about what that looks like. But as we want to ooze hospitality, it's a great way to start is to think about how would you be hospitable towards someone. And so we've put together this triangle, which will also be in the booklet. And these are some key things that you'll want to pay attention to before, during, and after your service. So in terms of understanding how to read this triangle, with a few exceptions, your guests will experience things from the bottom up. And so that actually means that you have least control over things at the bottom and more control over the things at the top. They're going to experience things from the bottom up. And so the left-hand side highlights the people that your guests will encounter, and the right-hand side highlights the programs or the non-people side of things that your guests will encounter. So we're going to dig into each of those briefly. I'll say a few things about them, and you'll get a sense of what we're trying to do at Grace City, how we've targeted each of these areas at Grace City. But at the end of each little section, so there's 8 there, I'd love to just get 2 people to add an extra suggestion. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's hear from each other. So I'll dig in and then be brave. Only 2 people will get to say something, so get in there. So starting with congregation on the bottom left. Now, how the average person in your congregation responds to the guests at church is something you have very little control over. Least control when it comes to the whole triangle. Now, we'll talk about welcomers and hosts, as I said, in just a moment. But you can't ultimately control who your guests end up talking to. You might have felt that before. Now, what you can do is hope that whoever they talk to, they make a nice connection, they get invited out to lunch after the service, they're showed around, and that by the end of the day, they've had a good time. But really, there's probably a few seasonal times where you can make initiatives to really encourage your congregation to do this well, whether that's an Easter get-together or a Christmas lunch or something like that. But for the most part, you really just have to pray that this happens really organically. You have to pray that your congregation is on board with greeting guests in a warm, welcoming, hospitable way. Now, that being said, if you pay attention to the other elements of the triangle, which we will get to, you'll probably find that they really work together to help build the kind of culture where this thing happens more than it doesn't happen. So as we think about these things, think about how you can build that type of culture at your church where it's just really natural for your congregation members to warmly greet guests. So 2 people who have a suggestion on how to make the congregation really great at oozing hospitality. No takers. Hello at the back.
I guess top-down modelling, so if you are a leader in your church, making efforts to model really welcoming being kind to people.
Fantastic. Yep. Top-down modelling. The leaders at church should be demonstrating this. It's not great if they whiz off to the office or huddle together after the service. The leaders should be modelling this. One more. Hi.
Got a starter question that would help our congregation give, and it's what brings you to church, or what brings you to Chapel Hill.
Great.
And that's a good conversation starter because it's not threatening, but also gets information.
Fantastic. So you've equipped your congregation with a starter question, which is what brings you along to blah, blah church today? And that's a great question, as you said, because it's not threatening, it's not too direct, it doesn't punch someone in the face, it warmly welcomes them with open arms, which is what we want to do. Fantastic. Let's move on to the next one so we can keep moving. Bottom right, we have facilities and signage. Now, the kind of facilities you have will actually have a really big impact on how warm and how welcoming someone finds your church. Now, you might not have the freedom to completely change your facilities. In fact, most of us probably don't have that freedom, which is why we've got it in this low control area. Now, that being said, even if you're starting with a pretty average school hall or something similar, there's a lot of things you can still do to make a space more welcoming. The first thing is making sure it's clean. That goes a really long way, especially the bathrooms. Dirty bathrooms, they're a big turn off. But the other thing is, well signed. If people don't know where they're supposed to go, they instantly feel like they're new, they instantly feel alienated. So signs to the bathroom, signs to where the person's supposed to go for the actual service, signs for what is happening next. But on top of that, on top of just being clean and tidy, don't underestimate the difference that you can make by just adding a few simple touches, whether that's plants or curtains or some mood lighting or something like that. I can't tell you how many churches I've been to that have the same Kmart plants, and it's great, us included. You can really increase the warmth and the positive feeling about your church space. Now, if this isn't your area of expertise, let's go back to our key ingredient from the beginning. Have a team of helpers. Find someone who loves decorating. Give them this project. Ask them to come and warm up your facilities. They will love it and they will do a great job creating a space where people actually want to come and hang out before and after your service. Because quite frankly, before and after your service is where we're spending time building those relationships. And so the longer we can get people there, spending time investing, the greater this community is going to grow to be. If it's a not very nice space, people won't want to stay there, which is just a real shame. A word of warning as well. Some of you might be in churches where you're bumping in, bumping out each day, you're setting up and tearing down each day. Which is totally okay, but it's worth saying that setting up is something, and adding extra touches and going to the effort of making your facilities nice is something that will get tiring really quickly if you're doing that every week. And that's very understandable. The temptation will be to stop doing that, but our big encouragement is don't. Grace City wasn't always in the building that it's in. We had a big season where we were moving around in and out of a cinema, in and out of a film school. It was tiring, but making church nice on a Sunday isn't for the people who are there every week. Well, it is actually in a way, but that's not what we're focusing on today. It's for those new guests that you're trying to connect into your community. So don't give up. 2 people to comment on facilities and signage, maybe simple ways you've done that. Positive tips. Hello. You have people in the car park? Great. Great. So you meet in a school, so you direct people from the car park and usher them all the way in, because it might be a bit of an obscure entrance even. Fantastic. One more I just saw behind there.
Maybe on your website, letting people know what they can expect.
Great. Yeah. On your website, letting people know what they can expect, where to find you, have some photos, what to wear, that type of thing. That's great. So facilities and signage. Let's move on to the third one there, which is hosts, cafe and kids teams on the left. Now, there's a bunch of different things that you can call your Connect teams, but we really love calling them hosts. Welcomers and greeters, it's good. It does seem to imply that the job kind of starts and finishes once you've welcomed or once you've greeted someone, which is actually not what we want. We want that job to continue as your guest is engaging with the service over a Sunday and on coming Sundays. So a host is someone with more responsibility than just a welcomer or just a greeter. So back to our dinner party or our brunch or whatever we decided to host, think about the way that you like to host. You might greet people at the door. You might usher them through your home and give them a tour. You might offer them a drink as soon as they arrive. You might chat with them. If you're having a big dinner party, you might introduce them to someone else at the table and connect them before telling them, hey, this is what the timeline of the night or the day is going to be. So a host actually follows that journey and makes sure that guest is being looked after. And so what we really want for our hosts at Grace City is to really intentionally keep an eye out for the guests that they've connected with at the front door until they leave at the end, to make sure that that person is enjoying themselves and having a good time. Now, on the occasions where we don't have enough hosts to cope with our newcomers, that's where coming back to your congregation is really helpful, because if your congregation is equipped and you have a culture, if we all do this, although our hosts specifically do this on certain Sundays, then you can actually connect John with congregation member and keep moving people along the pathway that way. So that's what our hosts should be doing at Grace City. So our hosts, their purpose is to welcome someone from the very first moment they come through the front door and do everything they can to care for our first-time guests and our second-time guests in particular. And as you've seen by our data, we do get a lot of first-time guests and second-time, so that's their focus. What they'll generally do, say hi at the door, they'll walk them in. They actually walk past the info desk at that stage, so if there's any information they want, they can grab it. They'll take them to our cafe space and have a free coffee, to get them a free coffee, introduce them to another member, and then let them know when the service will be starting before that host might return to the front door. So that's what it looks like for us. Our hosts also know that the end of the day, so once the service has happened, once they've had more conversations after the service, they need to report on that. So our hosts are very aware. Remember that person's name, remember their suburb. They all do that via different methods, but they know I need to tell my host leader information so that we can helpfully follow this person up and let them know we did connect with them in an intentional way. Now, in addition to our hosts, you'll want some kind of cafe or food teams. Food is a great thing that people gather around. And so you want to make sure that your cafe or your food teams really have that oozing hospitality vibe as well. You want them to greet people with a smile and serve them food with much joy, not in a begrudging way, like they're an inconvenience. Lots of joy, lots of smiles for our food teams. So in our context, we do coffee and snacks before the service, and then more substantial food after the service, although we don't do anything like lunch at this stage. We have platters of food. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about what we serve in a moment. And we've also included kids teams in this section because for visitors with kids, they usually just want to kind of bypass the info and make sure that their kids are going to be looked after that Sunday morning. So they usually head straight to the kids' rooms before they've done anything else. So it's really important that your kids leaders are aware of what to do with a new family or a new guest, whether you have a check-in system, what safety procedures need to happen. So it's important that your kids leaders are well trained at greeting new people and making sure parents are put at ease. If you're a parent, I'm sure you really understand that. And your kids area also needs to look safe and clear of clutter and somewhere that a parent will feel confident to leave their child. So a chance for comments on hosts, cafe teams and kids teams. Hello. Yep. So you've thought much more intentionally about how you can connect new families and children by making them just feel extra welcome with welcome packs and things. Has that been fruitful? Yeah, that's great to relieve those welcomers or hosts from being stuck in a situation for too long. Fantastic. One more comment? Hi.
It's interesting that you comment about the registration of children. I've got 4 boys.
Mm-hmm.
We went to a church and we got there 15 minutes early, but their registration of children on the iPad was so convoluted that we were still late to the service.
Yeah.
So I think it's important in those registration processes and all of that, there's a certain amount of information you need to get, especially about children, but making sure that it's user-friendly so that that doesn't become such a big process because we're all kind of didn't know where they were supposed to be. We were still giving them an iPad trying to get everything in.
Yeah.
So you've got to still make it as
Yeah. So you arrive somewhere early to check your kids in, and the system that the church has put in place doesn't work. That's very frustrating. So maybe if you're trying a new system or something, you can make sure there's someone there to man the system or something like that. I can see, Hazy, you're waving at me.
Just a question, so you're getting a lot of first-time visitors.
Correct.
Hosts are really interested for them the first time they come there. Do you have any kind of system to make sure that the second week they don't get overlooked? Like, do the hosts try their best to reconnect with whoever they met last week or looking out for them in the week?
Yeah, great question. So we get heaps of first timers. What happens to the second timers? Do they just get forgotten? We actually have that host report that I mentioned emailed to the team that is on the following week. So our hosts serve 2 weeks on, 4 weeks off. So if it's week 1 and week 2, that's really easy. They can reconnect. But if it's the new cycle of people, they've got that list of who was first time last week, so they can intentionally connect as well. Yeah. Although, not always done perfectly, but we try our best there. Let's move on to food and info desk. Yes, that's what we're up to. Okay, so not all churches offer food, and that's okay. But if you do, it's worth paying attention to the kind of food that you serve. This will probably depend on your demographic and location, but I think it's generally a good thing to serve food at your church, and just as you would if people came over to your house. But also to align those things. So the type of food that you serve at your house should be the type of food that you serve at church. So whether that's iced Vovos and jelly lollies at your house, you can do something like that at church. Whether that's home-baked cookies with garnish or blueberries, you can do that at church. So think about your context and, as the people of that church, the type of community that you're trying to build. And so you can see how those two things would align. Really, all the details aside, what it's about is oozing hospitality. So how can you ooze hospitality with the type of food that you serve? Now, the context that we're in, this is the type of food we serve. The local cafes, this is the type of food you would see. And so as we try to connect with our local area, this is the type of food we serve. We deliberately make it look nice. That means extra effort is required. That means we bought wooden boards instead of circle platters or something like that. We have gone to intentional efforts to consider what is happening in our community and how the people of our community are coming to our church and can feel most comfortable. Now, who pays for the food is probably what you're wondering. For the record, those brownies are from Coles and they are great. Depending on your church will depend on who pays for the food. At Grace City, we pay for the food. It's our cafe teams that purchase the food, prepare the food, present the food on Sunday, but then they submit their receipts for reimbursement. So church pays for the food. Now, we do that. We've intentionally budgeted for that because we think food is part of oozing hospitality. We have seen the way food has built the community before and after our formal Sunday service. And we never want our cafe team members to feel pressured or feel like they have to get stingy because they didn't get paid that week. We don't want any of that pressure to be on of our cafe team members. So we say, don't worry about the cost. This is what we're after. And then there's obviously a budget, but then they submit those receipts. Back to our diagram. So it's worth saying as well, for a long time I managed those cafe teams, and it's really easy for the standard to slip, or the type of hospitality you're after to slip. And it's not common for people to say, well, why do we do it this way instead of this way? Can't we just do it this way instead of this way? And so what's really important is that you train and you envision your food teams or your cafe teams for what you're trying to achieve. If you don't envision them for what you're trying to achieve, if we don't say the people of Green Square are coming to this church and this is what they see at the cafe next door and we want to be familiar to them, we want to show them we're so happy they've come and we want them to stay and talk after the service, there's enough food for them to do that, then the cafe person goes, well, what's the difference between this cake or the store-bought cookies or something like that? So you've got to keep envisioning that happening and keep encouraging that sense of oozing hospitality because we want people to stick around. So the hard compliment to our hosting teams, back to them, and our hosts is our info desk. You might have a welcome lounge, an info desk, or guest services. But basically what we're trying to identify is that really obvious place people can go when they want to initiate a next step. So whether that's finding out more about church or signing up for an event or something coming up, we really want people to know where to go to initiate their next step. And for us, that's an info desk. Super important is that you have a well-trained person at your info desk. First big no-no is an empty info desk. That's never good. Someone goes and they don't know what to do, or they have trouble with an iPad and they can't get it fixed. Second no-no is they go and the poor person is like, or they even give them the wrong information. That's not ideal. So you want your person at the info desk to be well trained, to be totally comfortable with randoms approaching them and comfortable with passing on that information. So this is what our info desk looks like. We have two actually. So our after service time is at a cafe next door. So we have to set this up every day. You can see the sneaky little box underneath the table. The hosts, they carry that box across before church. They set it up. We've tried to keep it simple. There's free Bibles available. There's free daily reading guides on the left, and there's a chance to sign up on the iPad in the middle with a host always standing there. So we set up and pack that down every Sunday. And then our ones, this is actually a really sad photo. I'm so sorry. That doesn't look very exciting. I wouldn't go there. But anyway, it looks better in the flesh. But basically this is, I've just walked in the door here and that info desk is right there on the right, so you can't miss it. And as you can see, we've got the same resources there. Now I've got a sample of all of our resources up here if you wanted to come and have a look. In the break or something. So we always have resources about Next Step, free Bibles, of course, and then in the drawers underneath is lots more information if people have questions that the host can pull out.
Is info desk unmanned?
No. Well, in the photo, yes, but I told you it was a lame photo, so don't judge me. The info desk is unmanned in the photos. My hosts aren't that on call, sadly. Okay, 2 comments about those things, info desk, food team, and food. Hello.
I think it's already been alluded to, but we also have like a kids sign-up desk.
You have a kids sign-up desk? That's great. And would the parents and families as they come in be just straight to the kids sign-up desk? Fantastic. And that's manned. That's great. If you have the resources for kids sign-up desk, that is fantastic. And just, yeah, it just streamlines things really well. One more comment. Hello.
Don't get an Anglo to look after food. Find someone from a culture that does food.
Yeah. I love it. Don't get an Anglo to look after food. I'll leave it at that. All right, let's jump on through. We're going to go 5 minutes over, and then we may need to finish a little bit of this section in the next hour and a half. We'll see how we go. Okay, so MC and preacher. By the time a guest is in your service, hopefully they've met people, they've gotten a coffee, they've known where the bathrooms are. There's a really simple thing that you can do on top of what's happened to them up until that point the service starts. And so your MC and your preacher has a great opportunity to just acknowledge a guest. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to have you here today. I'm delighted. Something really simple. It doesn't have to be, a mini sermon on being a guest. Just a brief nod to your guests is a really nice way that they can feel comfortable, feel welcome, to know that it's not weird for them to be there. And also a great thing an MC can do is acknowledge what is going to happen over the service time together. So that person can, if they've never been to a church service, they can just be familiar and brace themselves for the next hour and a bit. Okay, so MC and preacher. Now, depending on whether you have a printed, I've already said that, sorry. Yes, as well, on top of that, as well as letting them know what's happening. The MCs at our church and pretty much our whole church congregation knows that little script. Oh, you'll get here and we'll start with some singing and then we'll share about what's happening in the life of church and then we're going to open the Bible. That part of the service is not for your regulars. So it's very tempting to go, we do this every week. We know it off by heart. Let's get rid of that. But actually remember, just like setting up your space to look really lovely is particularly targeting your guests. So is that moment where you explain what's coming up in the service. So don't feel tempted to drop that off. It's important to make your guests settle in well. I'll jump to the next one as well. Announcements and welcome cards, because this is a big one, kind of an important one. So Announcements are the key way that you can direct people towards their next steps. Okay, announcements are the key way that you can direct people towards their next steps. So at Grace City, we have 2 specific next steps. It's whether you're a Christian or you're a non-Christian. So if you're a non-Christian, your next step is Explore or Explore Group. They are similar, they run back to back, just depends on which one's running at the time. For a Christian, your next step is On Board, which is our membership course. And so we really want these next steps to be announced almost every Sunday, because Explore runs most weeks anyway, and On Board runs once a month. So by the time you're announcing it for the upcoming one, it's almost every week. The good thing is most of the members at your church, as I said just before about what's coming up in the service, they'll start to be really familiar with this script. So even though they might go, oh, it's next step announcement time, turn off. If a newcomer asks them about what their next step should be, all the way back to our bottom left in the congregation, your church member will just have a brain tweak and they'll be able to say, your next step should be On Board. On Board is for Christians who are considering calling Grace City home. It's a great opportunity for us to share the vision and mission of Grace City Church, and it's a great opportunity for you to get more connected with other newcomers, learn about what we're on about, and meet some of the leadership team. On Board runs on the first Sunday of every month from 1 till 4 p.m. in our cafe space just out there. You can sign up at the info desk. Okay? So that's a great little positive about saying those next steps every single week. And that means your guests are going to really know what their next step is. So, second key part of the service time is welcome cards. Now, churches do welcome cards differently, but arguably this is the most important thing that you do, because if you can't get someone's details, then you can't follow them up as effectively as you'd really like to. Okay, so we encourage, we have a point towards the start of our service. We give our service announcements and then we go to our welcome cards, and we encourage everyone sitting in the room to do one, whether they're first timer, regular visitor or member. Okay, we encourage everyone to do them so that there's a little bit of peer pressure. I'm doing mine, you should do yours. But there's also no alienation of, oh, I'm very clearly a guest because I'm the only person doing this card. So we encourage everyone to do that. Now, then we, just in terms of what details you can collect, I've got our cards here. So you can see at the top, we have these boxes for first time, second time, regular. That helps us gather some of that data we talked about earlier. I've got samples of these down here as well, by the way. That's the front of our card, and then that's the back of our card. Now, the card has evolved a little bit over the years, it's worth saying. We've kind of tried to simplify it, make it very clear. Am I new to church? Is this whole thing new? Or am I new to this church? So that's the way we try to direct our mission contacts, those who are not Christians, and then those who are Christians looking to call Grace City their home church. So that's the front and back. For the record, we have tried digital welcome cards this year to varying success. We have 2 purposes for our welcome cards, which is probably the first problem. There it is. So welcome cards are primarily designed for the guest, and the guests like paper, okay? We've recorded every single week paper versus digital. The guests do the paper. That's what they're more comfortable with in our context. However, we also use our welcome cards to mark the role for our members, as I mentioned before, to care about our members, to go, hey, were they here? They haven't been here for a few weeks. We should follow them up. Our members love digital because they think, I do this every week. I've killed a forest. I feel bad. And so they like digital. So if I had to choose a goal for the welcome card, it would be for the guest. And so we would stick with paper. At the moment, we're doing both. But if we had to choose one, we would do paper. That's just to let you know about that. The great thing, however, about the digital is once they click submit, it takes them straight to our landing page. This is our digital next step sign up, the same thing that would be on our InfoDesk iPad. So that's one excellent thing about the digital welcome card, is you can just shove people towards the next step, which is really great. The landing page has been very successful. We have no paper sign up forms anywhere now. This is all connected with Alvanto, our online database. So we are going to finish at this one. I've got 2 more little things we can talk about in the next section, which are very practical, but 2 experts on the or comments, suggestions on the topic of welcome cards and announcements. Hello.
And it's more a
Question. Little pencils and bits of paper.
Yes.
Where do you keep them?
Great. Where do we keep them, before or after? Great, sure. We have a we have a support team at the start before the service. They go and put a card on every single chair and a tiny little pencil on every single chair. People come in, they pick it up, they usually put it on the ground or in their lap. Then they fill it out at the start of the service. Then our hosts instantly come around and collect them. So that's usually about a 3.5 minute process. So they're instantly connected. So they don't go into handbags. They don't get, coffee spilt on them or something. They instantly get collected, and then they are processed, for lack of a better word. Good question. One more. Hello.
So do you guys have, say, sermon outlines or that you give to people, or just that one card, and that's
Great question. Do we have sermon outlines or just the one card? At the moment, it's just the one card. Our preaching team, Tim Clemens, is very good at outlining his sermon verbally throughout. So you don't always need a sermon outline. Sometimes we have sermon outlines on slides if the sermon might have, particular layers upon layers of information. That's something we would really like to consider, though. And so we've thought about, could we integrate it here or something? But we've just kind of thought at this stage, this has its own purpose. Let's not clutter it with more things. But no, we don't have a digital sermon outline or a paper sermon outline at this stage. We're going to break, guys. This has been good. Tim and I will be around if you want to ask us questions, but I'll hand to Tony.
Thanks very much, Amy. We're going to break now. We're running a little bit over to try and squeeze more into that section. So we're due back here at 4. But we'll make it a 4:05 hard start. So you've got a few extra minutes, and Amy and Tim will continue there. I actually can't be here in the second half of the session, and that's devastating for all of you. But I'm sure they can finish things off. One interesting tip, since I have the microphone, one of the things we found at our church in welcoming people and getting information was that everybody in our local area, it's a big sort of real estate. Everyone's buying houses, and everyone's going to real estate, and everyone's really used to just turning up to the door and just signing their name and email and phone number on a clipboard. That's just what you do. You just go in, and when you go into the place, you just sign up. So we experimented with having someone with a clipboard right at the outset and just gave it to people, and they just wrote their name and then walked in. They sometimes even took their shoes off as well. So we live in a very Asian part of Sydney. So there's another interesting tip. You could try the clipboard. See you back at 4:05.